The encounter at Ravenwood Cafe. The wind carried a chill through the streets of Glen Haven, an unassuming small town known for its close-knit community and quiet charm. Evelyn Harrington, a 72-year-old retired nurse, stepped carefully onto the cobbled path leading to the newly renamed Ravenwood Cafe. Once a family-friendly spot called Sunrise Corner, the cafe now catered to a rougher crowd. Bikers had claimed the space, transforming its cheery ambience into something darker, with loud engines often heard rumbling outside. Evelyn's heart ached as she paused at the entrance, clutching the strap of her weathered purse. She wasn't here for confrontation. She wasn't here for memories. She was here to meet her son, Nathaniel, a Navy SEAL on leave, whom she hadn't seen in 2 years. As she stepped inside, the once vivid walls were now muted shades of gray, adorned with graffiti and worn posters advertising motorcycle rallies. Her arrival barely caused a ripple in the raucous atmosphere. Groups of leather-clad bikers occupied most of the tables, their booming laughter cutting through the faint hum of music. Evelyn carefully adjusted her glasses, scanning the room for a quiet corner. Her eyes landed on a small table near the window, and she shuffled toward it, her cane tapping softly against the floor. "Where do you think you're going, Granny?" a voice jeered. Evelyn flinched, turning to see a burly man in a faded leather jacket leaning against the counter. His beard was streaked with gray, and his expression was one of sneering amusement. "I'm just here to wait for someone," Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of unease in her chest. The man stepped forward, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. "This ain't no tea party. Maybe you should find a spot more fitting for your kind." Evelyn tightened her grip on her cane, her pride refusing to let her back down. "I'm here as a paying customer, like anyone else." The man chuckled darkly, stepping aside to let her pass. "Suit yourself, lady, but don't be surprised if someone shows you the door." Ignoring the murmurs that followed her, Evelyn made her way to the table by the window. She settled in and set her purse on the table, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out her phone. She quickly texted Nathaniel, letting him know she'd arrived, and then placed the device beside her cup of water. She stared out the window, trying to push away the hostility in the room. Her thoughts wandered to Nathaniel. The last time she'd seen him, he was a strong, confident young man, freshly promoted to chief petty officer. She had no doubt he'd grown even more capable in the intervening years. But what kind of toll had his service taken on him? Would he still be the same boy who used to sit by her side during quiet mornings, helping her bake cookies? "Excuse me," a waitress interrupted her thoughts, snapping Evelyn's attention back to the present. The waitress was young, her pink-dyed hair pulled into a high ponytail, but her expression mirrored the disdain Evelyn had already encountered. "What can I get you?" the waitress asked, her tone clipped. "A tea, please," Evelyn replied. "Chamomile, if you have it." The waitress raised an eyebrow, then glanced at the bikers gathered across the room. "Yeah, sure. Anything else?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, thank you." The waitress nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Evelyn exhaled deeply, trying to find calm amid the simmering tension. Moments later, the burly man from earlier approached her table. His presence cast a shadow over her as he leaned against the edge of her table. "You sure you're in the right place, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low and mocking. Evelyn met his gaze, her voice steady. "I'm waiting for my son. He'll be here soon." The man smirked, his eyes narrowing. "Your son, huh? What, he's some big shot gonna come teach us a lesson?" Evelyn didn't flinch. "He's just my son," she said simply, refusing to engage with his hostility. The man snorted and straightened up. "Well, enjoy your tea while you can, Grandma. Don't say I didn't warn you." As he walked away, Evelyn's phone buzzed. She picked it up, her spirits lifting at the sight of Nathaniel's message. "Be there in 10. Can't wait to see you, Mom." She smiled, clutching the phone to her chest. Whatever hostility this place harbored, it would all fade once Nathaniel arrived. The next 10 minutes passed slowly, each second marked by the weight of the stairs and whispers around her. When the door finally swung open, Evelyn's heart soared. Nathaniel stepped inside, his broad shoulders and confident stride immediately commanding attention. He wore a casual button-down shirt and jeans, but his demeanor was unmistakable. This was a man accustomed to taking charge. Nathaniel's sharp gaze swept the room, immediately locking onto his mother. The warmth in his eyes melted away the tension in Evelyn's chest. She rose to greet him, her smile faltering slightly as she saw several bikers exchanging glances, their expressions turning predatory. "Mom," Nathaniel greeted her warmly, pulling her into a strong embrace. "It's so good to see you." Before Evelyn could respond, the burly man from earlier interrupted. Well, this must be the son," he drawled. "What's the matter, pretty boy? Mama bring you here to babysit her?" Nathaniel's grip on his mother tightened protectively. He turned to face the man, his expression unreadable. "Is there a problem here?" The man laughed, stepping closer. "Yeah, there's a problem. Your kind don't belong here." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "We're not looking for trouble, just here to catch up." The man's smirk widened. "Trouble? Oh, you'll know trouble when it finds you." Evelyn tugged gently on Nathaniel's arm, her voice soft. "Let's just go somewhere else, Nathaniel. It's not worth it." Nathaniel shook his head, his eyes locked on the man. "No, Mom, we're not going anywhere. This is a public space." The air in the cafe grew heavy, the tension almost tangible. Evelyn could feel the stares of every patron in the room, their curiosity feeding the charged atmosphere. She clutched Nathaniel's arm, silently willing the moment to pass. But it didn't. Confrontation in the cafe. Nathaniel held his mother's arm gently, guiding her back to her seat at the table by the window. The cafe buzzed with a tension that made the air feel heavy, but Nathaniel's calm demeanor never wavered. He had spent years training to manage high-pressure situations. No amount of sneering bikers would push him to act rashly. The burly man, who had now been joined by two other equally imposing figures, wasn't done. He leaned against the counter, smirking as he eyed Nathaniel. His companions muttered among themselves, their eyes flicking between Nathaniel and Evelyn. "Seems like Junior here thinks he's something special," the burly man said loudly enough for the entire cafe to hear. His voice dripped with derision, drawing a few chuckles from other bikers scattered around the room. Nathaniel turned to face him, his expression as steady as stone. "I'm not here to prove anything," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to have a quiet meal with my mother." The man's smirk widened, and he pushed himself off the counter. His boots thudded against the floor as he closed the distance to Nathaniel and Evelyn's table. "You think that uniform of yours makes you untouchable," he sneered, motioning toward the Navy SEAL patch stitched onto Nathaniel's back. "Around here, we don't care about rank or titles." Nathaniel slowly rose to his full height, towering over the man. His movements were deliberate, controlled. "I suggest you go back to your table," he said quietly, his tone carrying a warning that wasn't lost on the bikers. Evelyn reached for Nathaniel's hand, her voice trembling. "Nathaniel, please." "It's okay, Mom," Nathaniel assured her without taking his eyes off the man in front of him. The burly man's smirk faltered for a split second, but his bravado quickly returned. He gestured to his companions. "You see this? He thinks he's in charge here." One of the other bikers, a lean man with a shaved head and tattoos crawling up his neck, snorted. "Maybe we should show him how things work around here." Nathaniel's eyes flicked toward the second man, assessing him with the precision of someone who had been trained to evaluate threats. He knew the situation could escalate quickly, but he also knew he couldn't afford to make the first move. Years of discipline and experience kept him rooted, his stance neutral but ready. The cafe had gone eerily quiet, the other patrons watching with wide eyes. The waitress, still holding a tray of drinks, stood frozen by the counter, her face pale. Even the cafe owner, a wiry man in his late 40s, appeared too afraid to intervene. Nathaniel's gaze shifted back to the burly man. "You've had your fun," he said evenly. "It's time to let it go." The man's face darkened, his hand twitching as if he were considering reaching for the knife sheathed on his belt. "You think you can come in here and tell us what to do? You don't know who you're dealing with." Evelyn stood abruptly, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "Enough," she said, her tone surprisingly forceful. She stepped forward, her hand trembling but her resolve unshaken. "This is a cafe, not a battleground. We came here for peace, not conflict." The burly man turned his attention to Evelyn, his lips curling into a sneer. "Lady, if you don't sit down, you will." Before he could finish his sentence, Nathaniel moved. In an instant, he stepped between the man and his mother, his posture commanding. "Don't finish that sentence," Nathaniel said, his voice low and deadly serious. "You're not going to threaten her." The man hesitated, his bravado wavering under the intensity of Nathaniel's gaze. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "Hey, Bill," one of the bikers said, his voice laced with unease. "Maybe we should just let it go. The cops are always patrolling around here." But Bill, the burly man, wasn't ready to back down. His pride had been challenged, and he wasn't about to let it go unanswered. "You think you're some kind of hero." He spat at Nathaniel. "This is our territory, and you're nothing but an outsider." Nathaniel took a slow step forward, closing the gap between them. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. "You're going to step back. Now." Bill clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he weighed his options. The room seemed to tilt on the edge of chaos, the bikers waiting for a signal from their leader. But Nathaniel didn't flinch, his calm demeanor unnerving in its intensity. Finally, Bill took a step back, muttering under his breath, "This ain't over." Nathaniel didn't respond. He simply stood there, his presence a silent challenge, until Bill and his companions retreated to their table. The tension in the room didn't completely dissipate, but the immediate threat had passed. Evelyn exhaled shakily, her hand clutching her chest. "Nathaniel, please, let's just go." Nathaniel turned to her, his expression softening. "I'm sorry you had to see that, Mom. Let's get you somewhere safer." They gathered their things and began to leave, the eyes of the entire cafe following them. As they stepped outside into the crisp evening air, Evelyn paused, her hand on Nathaniel's arm. "I'm proud of you, son," she said softly, "but I'm scared for you too." Nathaniel placed a reassuring hand over hers. "You don't need to worry about me, Mom. I've been through worse." But as they walked down the street, the weight of what had just happened lingered between them. Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of it, and he knew he'd do whatever it took to protect his mother, no matter what came next. A brewing storm. The drive back to Evelyn's modest suburban home was silent, the tension from the cafe clinging to both mother and son like a heavy fog. Nathaniel's hands gripped the steering wheel with the precision of a soldier, his mind running over the confrontation at the cafe. His military training taught him to assess and de-escalate situations, but something about the bikers didn't sit right with him. Their smugness, their united front. It wasn't just bravado. They operated like a gang, and gangs rarely let humiliation slide. Evelyn, seated in the passenger seat, glanced at her son. The streetlights illuminated the hardened lines of his face, a mix of resolve and simmering anger. She knew him well enough to recognize the storm brewing behind his stoic exterior. "You've been quiet," she said softly, breaking the silence. Nathaniel glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "Just thinking." "About what?" She pressed gently. He exhaled through his nose, a sharp, measured sound. "Those men, they're not just bullies. There's something organized about them." Evelyn's hands tightened on her purse. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Nathaniel hesitated. His instinct was to reassure her, to tell her she had nothing to worry about. But Evelyn had raised him to value honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. "It's possible," he admitted. Men like that don't take public embarrassment lightly. Evelyn sighed, her shoulders sagging. This town used to be so peaceful. I don't understand how things changed so much. Nathaniel reached over and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. It's not your fault, Mom. And you're not alone in this. We'll handle whatever comes. Evelyn managed a small smile, though her heart was heavy. You always say we, Nathaniel, even when it's just you taking on the world. He chuckled softly, a rare sound that warmed her heart despite the tension. It's because I always carry you with me, Mom. You've been my anchor since day one. The rest of the drive passed in companionable silence. When they arrived at Evelyn's house, Nathaniel took a moment to survey the surroundings. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where porch lights glowed warmly and neighbors exchanged friendly waves. But tonight, it felt different. Too still, too quiet. His instincts, honed over years of missions in hostile territory, prickled at the edges of his awareness. As they stepped inside, Nathaniel automatically checked the locks on the doors and windows. Evelyn watched him with a mix of gratitude and sadness, knowing his vigilance came from a lifetime of experiences she couldn't fully understand. I'll make some tea, she offered, trying to restore a sense of normalcy. Nathaniel nodded. I'll be in the living room. While Evelyn busied herself in the kitchen, Nathaniel settled on the couch. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the framed photos of their family. One picture caught his attention, a faded image of him, his late father, and his brothers, Mark and Jason. They were smiling, arms slung around each other, with Evelyn standing behind them, her hands on her husband's shoulders. It was a simpler time, before deployments and distance had pulled the family apart. Nathaniel wondered when they'd all been in the same room last. His father's death had fractured something between them, and though they still spoke occasionally, it wasn't the same. Evelyn returned with 2 steaming mugs of tea, her movements slow but steady. She placed one on the coffee table in front of Nathaniel and sat beside him. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, taking a sip from her mug. Nathaniel gave her a small smile. "Just remembering Dad. And thinking about Mark and Jason." Evelyn sighed, her gaze softening. "They've been distant, haven't they?" Nathaniel nodded. "Everyone's busy with their own lives. But maybe it's time we changed that. After today, I think we need to stick together more." Evelyn reached for his hand, her eyes misty. "I'd like that, Nathaniel. More than you know." Their quiet moment was interrupted by a faint noise outside, a low rumble that sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. Nathaniel's head snapped toward the window, his body instantly alert. He rose from the couch, moving to the front door with the quiet precision of a predator. Evelyn followed him, her heart racing. "What is it?" Nathaniel held up a hand, signaling her to stay back. He peered through the peephole, his sharp gaze narrowing. A group of motorcycles was parked across the street, their riders dismounting. Nathaniel counted 4 men, including the burly leader from the cafe. "Stay inside," he said, his voice a low command. "Lock the door behind me." "What?" "Nathaniel, you can't." Evelyn started, but he cut her off with a stern look. "I'll handle this," he said firmly. "Call the police if anything happens." Evelyn hesitated, her hands trembling, but she nodded and stepped back as Nathaniel opened the door and stepped outside. The cool night air hit him like a slap, but his focus was razor sharp. He approached the edge of the porch, his movements slow and deliberate. The bikers turned toward him, their expressions predatory. Bill stepped forward, a twisted grin on his face. "Well, look who decided to show some guts," Bill sneered. "We thought we'd stop by and have a little chat." Nathaniel crossed his arms, his stance relaxed but ready. "You don't scare me, Bill. If you're here to make a point, spit it out." Bill chuckled darkly, his companions joining in. "You embarrassed us back there, soldier boy. Nobody makes us look weak." Nathaniel's eyes hardened. "You embarrassed yourselves when you went after an old woman. That's on you." Bill's grin disappeared, replaced by a snarl. Big talk for a guy standing alone. Nathaniel stepped forward, closing the distance between them. You think I'm alone? You think I need backup to handle cowards like you? The air grew electric, the bikers shifting uneasily as Nathaniel's presence seemed to grow. Bill's bravado faltered, but he recovered quickly, pulling a knife from his belt and flipping it open. You've got guts, I'll give you that, Bill said, his voice low and menacing. But guts don't mean a damn thing when you're outnumbered. Nathaniel's lips curled into a faint smile, his voice calm and steady. You don't want to do this. The bikers exchanged glances, their confidence shaken by Nathaniel's unwavering composure. Bill hesitated, his grip on the knife tightening, but before he could act, the wail of sirens pierced the night air. Red and blue lights illuminated the street as two police cruisers pulled up, their tires screeching to a halt. The bikers froze, their plan unraveling before their eyes. The officers stepped out, their hands resting on their holsters. One of them, a seasoned sergeant, addressed the bikers sternly. You all better have a damn good reason for being here. Nathaniel stepped back, allowing the officers to take control. He turned toward the porch, where Evelyn stood just inside the door, her phone in hand. Their eyes met, and he gave her a small nod of reassurance. As the bikers were questioned and eventually escorted away, Nathaniel returned to the house, his adrenaline still coursing through him. Evelyn met him with a trembling hug, her relief palpable. I told you to call the police if anything happened, Nathaniel said gently, his arms around her. Evelyn pulled back, her eyes glistening. I couldn't just stand by, Nathaniel. You're my son. Nathaniel smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude and pride. You're braver than most people I know, Mom. But as they locked the door and sat back down in the living room, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that the bikers weren't done. The storm was far from over, and he would be ready when it came. Shadows in the night. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Evelyn's modest living room. Despite the golden warmth of the day, a sense of unease lingered in the house. Evelyn stood at the kitchen counter, her hands carefully pouring steaming water into two ceramic mugs. The soft clink of the kettle against the counter broke the silence, but her mind was far from at ease. Nathaniel sat at the dining table, his shoulders tense as he scrolled through his phone, scanning headlines and messages from his military contacts. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with contingency plans. The incident with the bikers was no longer a one-off encounter, it was a brewing conflict. Evelyn placed a mug of coffee in front of him, her own cup of tea cradled in her hands as she sat across from him. You haven't touched your breakfast, she said softly, glancing at the untouched plate of eggs and toast. Nathaniel looked up, his expression softened by her concern. I'm not hungry, Mom. Just trying to figure out what's next. Evelyn frowned, sipping her tea to hide her trembling hands. Nathaniel, do you really think they'll come back? The police seemed to handle things last night. Nathaniel set his phone down, leaning forward. Mom, I wish I could say it's over, but men like Bill don't let things go easily. They're not just random thugs. They're organized, and they're not afraid to push boundaries. Evelyn's grip on her cup tightened. Then what do we do? Should we leave town? No, Nathaniel said firmly. Running won't solve anything. Besides, this is your home. You've lived here for years. You shouldn't have to give that up because of them. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew Nathaniel's protectiveness was rooted in love, but she hated the thought of him putting himself in harm's way for her. I don't want you risking your life, Nathaniel. You've already done enough of that for this country. Nathaniel smiled faintly. This isn't just about protecting you, Mom. It's about standing up to people who think they can intimidate others into silence. Before Evelyn could respond, a loud knock echoed through the house, startling both of them. Nathaniel was on his feet in an instant, his posture alert. He motioned for Evelyn to stay put as he moved toward the door. Looking through the peephole, Nathaniel saw a familiar face. Officer Daniels, the younger of the two policemen who had arrived the night before. Nathaniel opened the door cautiously. "Officer," he greeted, "what brings you here?" Daniels shifted on his feet, his expression grim. "Morning, Lieutenant Carter. I thought I'd stop by to give you an update. Mind if I come in?" Nathaniel stepped aside, letting the officer enter. Evelyn joined them in the living room, offering a polite nod as she gestured for Daniels to sit. He declined, standing near the door instead. "We've detained the bikers from last night," Daniels began, his voice measured. "But Bill was bailed out this morning. We're still investigating, but let's just say he's got some powerful friends who seem willing to pull strings." Evelyn's face paled. "So he's free?" Daniels nodded grimly. "For now. I wanted to warn you because, well, men like him don't take kindly to being humiliated." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Let me guess. They'll be looking for payback." Daniels hesitated, but eventually nodded. "It's likely. That gang isn't just a group of bikers. They're part of a larger network that's been operating in this region for years. Drugs, extortion, illegal weapons. You name it. The problem is, they keep their tracks covered well enough that we haven't been able to take them down." Evelyn's hands trembled as she sat on the edge of the couch. "What can we do, officer? We can't live like this, looking over our shoulders every day." Daniels glanced at Nathaniel, then back at Evelyn. "I can arrange for extra patrols in this area, but with limited resources, I can't guarantee round-the-clock protection. The best advice I can give is to stay vigilant and document anything suspicious." Nathaniel crossed his arms, his mind racing. "Thanks for the warning, officer. But if they come back, I'll be ready." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "I don't doubt your skills, Lieutenant, but I'd caution against taking matters into your own hands. These guys don't fight fair." Nathaniel gave a small nod, though his silence spoke volumes. Daniels sighed, handing him a card. "If anything happens, call me directly. Don't try to handle this alone." After the officer left, Evelyn turned to Nathaniel, her eyes filled with worry. "You're not planning on confronting them, are you?" Nathaniel hesitated, then placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'm just planning on keeping us safe, Mom." Later that night, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood in shadow. Nathaniel sat by the window, the lights in the house dimmed to make it harder for anyone outside to see in. He had positioned himself strategically, his sharp eyes scanning the street for any signs of movement. Evelyn had tried to convince him to rest, but he refused. Instead, she had gone to bed reluctantly, though Nathaniel doubted she'd find any real sleep. The hours ticked by, the quiet of the night punctuated only by the occasional bark of a distant dog. Just as Nathaniel began to think the night might pass uneventfully, a faint sound reached his ears, the unmistakable growl of motorcycle engines. He stiffened, his body snapping to attention as the sound grew louder. Peering through the curtains, he saw them. A group of 6 bikers, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they parked a few houses down the street. Nathaniel's mind raced. Why stop there? Were they scouting? Planning something? His instincts screamed that this was no coincidence. He slipped into the kitchen and grabbed his phone, dialing Officer Daniels' number. The call went straight to voicemail. Frustration flared in his chest, but he quickly texted Daniels the details and his location. Returning to the living room, Nathaniel retrieved the duffel bag he had brought from his car earlier. Inside were essentials he never traveled without: a compact first aid kit, a tactical flashlight, and a sturdy combat knife. While he wasn't armed with a firearm due to civilian regulations, he was confident in his ability to defend himself and his mother with what he had. The bikers remained parked down the street for another 10 minutes, their figures barely visible in the dim light. Then, one by one, they began to approach the house. Nathaniel's heart pounded, not with fear but with anticipation. He moved quietly to Evelyn's room and gently woke her. "Mom," he whispered, "we've got company." Stay here and lock the door behind me. Don't open it unless it's me, okay? Evelyn's eyes widened in fear, but she nodded. Be careful, Nathaniel. He kissed her forehead. I will. Slipping back into the living room, Nathaniel positioned himself near the front door, his muscles coiled like a spring. As the sound of boots crunching on gravel grew closer, he steeled himself. If these men thought they could intimidate him or harm his family, they were about to learn the hard way just how wrong they were. The breaking point. Nathaniel crouched by the living room window, his body tense and ready for action. Through the curtains, he counted the figures approaching the house. 4 men, their shadows long and menacing under the faint glow of the streetlights. They moved with deliberate caution, spreading out to cover the front yard and side entrance. One remained by the motorcycles parked further down the street, clearly on lookout duty. The faint hum of adrenaline began to pulse through Nathaniel's veins. His training kicked in, his mind mapping out potential points of entry and strategies to neutralize the threat. He wasn't looking for a fight, but if one came, he would ensure it ended quickly and decisively. From the hallway, Evelyn's muffled voice broke through his focus. Nathaniel, what's happening? He crept to her door and spoke quietly. Stay inside, Mom. Don't open the door unless I say it's safe. Call Officer Daniels again. Tell him it's urgent. Her voice trembled. Please, Nathaniel, don't do anything reckless. He paused, placing a hand on the door, as if she could feel the reassurance through it. I'll be fine, Mom. Just trust me. Turning back to the living room, Nathaniel grabbed his flashlight and combat knife. He checked the locks on the windows and doors once more, ensuring every possible entry point was secure. Then he turned off the remaining lights, plunging the house into darkness. If the bikers wanted to come inside, they'd be walking into his territory. Outside, the crunch of footsteps drew closer. A voice, low and mocking, carried through the night. Come on, soldier boy, one of the men taunted. You gonna hide in there all night? Or are you man enough to face us? Nathaniel didn't respond. Silence was a powerful tool, and he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of knowing his exact location. He moved to the side window, peeking out just enough to catch a glimpse of their positions. 2 were circling toward the back of the house, while the other 2 remained near the front porch. The taunting continued, the voices growing bolder. You think you're some big hero, huh? This is payback for making us look bad. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, his mind racing through options. He needed to draw their attention away from the house, and from Evelyn. An idea formed, risky but necessary. Grabbing a small decorative stone from the windowsill, he waited until one of the bikers walked past the side yard. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the stone clattering into the bushes near the driveway. The sound worked as intended. The man whipped around, signaling to his partner. Over there. Check it out. As they moved toward the noise, Nathaniel slipped out through the back door, his footsteps silent on the soft grass. Staying low, he maneuvered around the side of the house, positioning himself behind the 2 bikers investigating the noise. See anything? One of them asked, his voice tense. No, just some den. The man's words were cut off as Nathaniel sprang into action. He grabbed the closer of the 2, a wiry man with a bandana, and clamped a hand over his mouth. A swift, calculated blow to the side of the neck rendered him unconscious. The second man turned just in time to see his partner collapse, but Nathaniel was already moving. A quick jab to the solar plexus sent him doubling over, and a final strike to the temple left him sprawled on the ground. Nathaniel dragged their limp bodies behind the bushes, ensuring they were out of sight before checking the street. The lookout near the motorcycles was still in position, his attention focused on the house. The remaining 2 bikers were now on the porch, their voices louder as frustration crept into their tone. Where the hell is he? One of them barked, banging on the door. Come out and face us, coward. Nathaniel knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to break in. He couldn't let it get that far. Moving silently along the side of the house, he positioned himself near the porch, his knife at the ready. One of the bikers, a heavy-set man with tattoos snaking up his arms, stepped off the porch, scanning the yard. He's got to be hiding somewhere. Spread out and find him. Perfect. Nathaniel waited until the man was a few steps away before stepping into his path. The biker barely had time to register the movement before Nathaniel struck. A sharp blow to the man's wrist disarmed him, sending a small crowbar clattering to the ground. A well-placed kick to the back of his knee brought him down, and Nathaniel quickly subdued him with a chokehold. The final biker, hearing the commotion, turned and drew a knife, his eyes wild as he spotted Nathaniel. "You son of a..." Nathaniel dodged the wild slash with ease, his movements controlled and efficient. He parried the next attack with his flashlight, the heavy metal casing knocking the blade from the man's hand. Before the biker could recover, Nathaniel delivered a powerful strike to his chest, sending him sprawling onto the porch. The lookout near the motorcycles finally noticed the chaos and started toward the house, but before he could reach the porch, the sound of sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed as police cars screeched to a halt at the end of the street. Nathaniel stepped back, his chest heaving as he surveyed the scene. 4 incapacitated bikers lay scattered around the yard, and the 5th was now sprinting back toward his motorcycle. He didn't make it far. Officer Daniels emerged from one of the patrol cars, drawing his weapon and shouting, "Freeze!" hands in the air. The biker hesitated, then raised his hands, dropping to his knees as the officers surrounded him. Within minutes, the police had the situation under control, cuffing the bikers and loading them into the waiting cars. Daniels approached Nathaniel, his expression a mix of concern and respect. "You've had quite a night." Nathaniel wiped the sweat from his brow, his adrenaline finally starting to ebb. "Had to keep them away from my mom. You got here just in time." Daniels glanced at the unconscious men scattered around the yard. "Remind me never to pick a fight with you." Nathaniel managed a faint smile, though his thoughts were already turning to Evelyn. He hurried inside, finding her still in her locked room. She opened the door the moment she heard his voice, her face pale but relieved. "It's over, Mom," he said, pulling her into a hug. "You're safe." Evelyn clung to him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I was so scared, Nathaniel. I thought I might lose you." "You won't," he promised. "Not tonight. Not ever." As the police cleared the scene outside, Nathaniel and Evelyn sat together in the quiet of their home. The threat had been neutralized, but Nathaniel knew it wasn't the end. The bikers had connections, and their retaliation could escalate. But for now, his mother was safe, and that was all that mattered. Nathaniel glanced at Evelyn, her hand still trembling as she sipped her tea. He reached over, covering her hand with his own. "Mom," he said softly, "we'll face whatever comes. Together." And in that moment, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, they found strength in each other. A stand for justice. The morning sun spilled over the horizon, casting a soft golden hue across Evelyn's neighborhood. It seemed almost cruel how peaceful the day looked after the chaos of the previous night. Nathaniel sat on the porch steps, his sharp eyes scanning the street as he sipped his coffee. Despite the calm, he couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't the end. Inside, Evelyn moved about the kitchen with quiet determination. She had insisted on making breakfast for Nathaniel, as if the familiar routine might restore a sense of normalcy. Her bruised face bore testimony to the hardships of the past few days, but her spirit remained unbroken. Nathaniel glanced at his phone, which buzzed with a text from Officer Daniels. "We've got the bikers in custody, but there's something you should know. Call me when you can." His jaw tightened as he dialed the number. Daniels answered on the second ring, his voice low and cautious. "Lieutenant Carter, glad you called." "What's the update?" Nathaniel asked, his tone clipped. Daniels hesitated before replying. "We've been digging into the gang's background. The guys from last night are just the tip of the iceberg. Their leader, Bill Marshall, is part of a larger operation, the Iron Jackals. They've got a reputation for retaliating when they feel slighted. Nathaniel's grip on the phone tightened. So you're telling me this isn't over? Not yet, Daniels admitted. But we're building a case. Last night's arrests helped, and the evidence we gathered could tie them to a number of other crimes. We just need time to bring it all together. Nathaniel frowned. Time isn't something we have. They're not going to wait while you build a case. I get that, Daniel said, his voice firm. That's why we're stepping up patrols in your area. We're not letting them get near you or your mom again. Nathaniel's gaze swept the street, his mind racing with contingency plans. Thanks for the heads up. Keep me posted. As he ended the call, Evelyn stepped out onto the porch, carrying a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. Everything okay? She asked, her eyes searching his face. Nathaniel forced a smile. Just an update from the police. They got the bikers in custody, but they're connected to a bigger group. We'll need to stay vigilant. Evelyn sat beside him, setting the plate down between them. Nathaniel, I've been thinking about what happened last night. We can't keep living like this, afraid, waiting for the next attack. I know, he said quietly. That's why I've been working on a plan. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. A plan. Nathaniel nodded, his expression serious. We're not going to sit around and wait for them to come to us. We're going to take the fight to them, legally. Evelyn blinked in surprise. Legally? What do you mean? We're going to make sure their operation is exposed, Nathaniel explained. I've been in touch with some of my old contacts in the Navy. One of them works in federal law enforcement now, and they specialize in dismantling organized crime networks. If we can get the right information to the right people, we can take the entire Iron Jackals gang down. Evelyn's brow furrowed. But how are we supposed to get that information? It's not like we can just walk into their hideout and start asking questions. Nathaniel gave her a reassuring look. That's where I come in. I know how to gather intel without putting us in unnecessary danger. We just need to be smart about it. Evelyn hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. Nathaniel, this sounds dangerous. I don't want you getting hurt, or worse. He placed a hand on hers, his voice steady. Mom, I've faced worse situations than this. And I'm not doing this alone. We'll work with the police and federal agents every step of the way. But we have to do something. If we don't, they'll keep terrorizing people, and I can't live with that. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but promise me you'll be careful. I promise, he said, squeezing her hand. A targeted plan. Over the next few days, Nathaniel worked tirelessly, coordinating with Officer Daniels and his federal contact, Agent Rebecca Torres. Torres was a seasoned investigator with a no-nonsense attitude and a deep understanding of criminal networks. She quickly became a vital ally in their efforts. Here's what we know so far, Torres said during a conference call with Nathaniel and Daniels. The Iron Jackals have a base of operations in a warehouse on the outskirts of town. We've suspected it's being used to store illegal weapons and drugs, but we've never had enough evidence to get a warrant. What about last night's arrests? Nathaniel asked. Can't we use that as leverage? We're working on it, Torres replied. But we need more concrete proof, something that ties the warehouse directly to their illegal activities. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. What if I can get eyes on the warehouse? See what's going in and out? Daniels interjected, his tone wary. That's risky, Carter. If they catch you snooping around, it could get ugly fast. Nathaniel smirked. They won't catch me. I've done surveillance in much tougher environments. Torres considered this for a moment. If you're willing to take the risk, it could give us the edge we need. But you'll have to be extremely careful. One misstep, and they'll know we're onto them. Nathaniel nodded. Understood. The surveillance mission. That evening, Nathaniel parked his car a mile away from the warehouse and continued on foot, keeping to the shadows. He wore dark clothing and carried a small backpack containing a high-powered binoculars, a notebook, and a camera with a telephoto lens. Every step was calculated, his movements silent as he approached the warehouse. From his vantage point on a nearby hill, Nathaniel had a clear view of the building. The warehouse was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, and several motorcycles were parked near the entrance. A pair of men stood guard, their postures relaxed but watchful. Nathaniel settled into position, using the binoculars to scan the area. He noted the number of guards, the layout of the property, and the vehicles coming and going. Every detail was meticulously recorded, his military training ensuring nothing was overlooked. Hours passed, and Nathaniel remained vigilant. Just after midnight, a black van pulled up to the warehouse. Two men emerged, carrying heavy duffel bags that they handed off to the guards. Nathaniel snapped several photos, his pulse quickening. This could be the evidence they needed. As the van drove away, Nathaniel caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Bill Marshall stepping out of the warehouse. The burly biker barked orders at the guards, his demeanor radiating authority. Nathaniel focused the camera on him, capturing his every move. By the time dawn began to break, Nathaniel had enough evidence to make his case. He packed up his gear and slipped away, his heart pounding with a mix of exhaustion and determination. This was far from over, but for the first time, he felt they had a fighting chance. Justice delivered. Nathaniel returned home, just as the first rays of sunlight began to stretch across the sky. Evelyn was waiting for him, her worry evident as she met him at the door. She took in his tired face, the slight smudge of dirt on his cheek, and the backpack slung over his shoulder. "You're back," she said, relief flooding her voice. "Were you careful?" "Always," he finished, managing a small smile. "I got what we needed." They sat at the kitchen table, and Nathaniel pulled out his camera, showing Evelyn the photos he had taken. She leaned in, her lips pressing into a thin line as she saw Bill Marshall barking orders and the black van unloading its suspicious cargo. "This proves they're more than just a gang," Nathaniel said. "They're running a full-blown operation. Drugs, weapons, who knows what else. These photos tie Bill directly to the warehouse." Evelyn's hands trembled as she set down the camera. "What happens now?" "I'm sending everything to Agent Torres," Nathaniel replied. "She'll use it to secure a warrant and raid the place. Once the warehouse is taken down, the Iron Jackals will lose their power base. This is the endgame, Mom." Evelyn reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "Nathaniel, promise me you'll let the authorities handle it from here. You've done enough." Nathaniel hesitated but finally nodded. "I promise." The raid. 2 nights later, Nathaniel, Evelyn, and Officer Daniels sat in Evelyn's living room, the air thick with anticipation. Agent Torres had coordinated a joint task force to raid the warehouse. Nathaniel had provided every detail he'd observed, helping the team plan their approach with precision. A tense silence filled the room as they waited for updates. Evelyn clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her lips moving in a quiet prayer. Nathaniel sat beside her, his posture rigid, every muscle in his body wound tight. The first call came an hour later. Daniels answered, his face lighting up as he relayed the news. "The raid's underway. No injuries so far. They've secured the perimeter and detained a dozen members." Nathaniel exhaled, but he wasn't ready to celebrate yet. "What about Bill?" Daniels listened intently as more updates came through. Finally, he looked up, a triumphant smile on his face. "They've got him. Bill Marshall's in custody, and they're finding more evidence inside the warehouse. Guns, drugs, counterfeit money. It's enough to bring down the entire operation." Evelyn covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's over?" "It's over," Daniels confirmed. Nathaniel leaned back, the weight of the past few days finally lifting from his shoulders. He looked at his mother, who was now crying quietly, and pulled her into a hug. "We're safe now, Mom. It's done. A new chapter." The days that followed were a whirlwind of media coverage and legal proceedings. The Iron Jackal's network unraveled as members flipped for reduced sentences, leading to further arrests and the dismantling of their entire operation. Bill Marshall faced multiple charges, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Evelyn's neighborhood began to feel like home again, the shadow of fear replaced by a renewed sense of community. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now stopped by to offer words of support, and the cafe that had been the gang's unofficial base was sold to new owners who promised to restore its welcoming atmosphere. Nathaniel stayed with Evelyn for another week, helping her settle back into a life free of fear. They spent quiet mornings on the porch, reminiscing about the past and making plans for the future. On his final day in town, Nathaniel packed his bag and prepared to return to his base. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her eyes glistening as she hugged him tightly. "You've always been my hero, Nathaniel," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I just did what Dad would have done." Evelyn nodded, a bittersweet smile crossing her face. "He'd be so proud of you." As Nathaniel drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror to see Evelyn waving from the porch. Though his mission was over, he knew he would carry the lessons of the past weeks with him. It wasn't just about protecting his mother, it was about standing up for what was right, no matter the odds. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, Nathaniel felt a quiet sense of fulfillment, knowing that their story wasn't just about surviving adversity, but overcoming it together. Epilogue. Months later, Evelyn received a package in the mail. Inside was a letter from Nathaniel and a framed photo of the two of them standing in front of her house. The note read, "Mom, this is just a reminder that we can face anything together. Thank you for always being my anchor. Love, Nathaniel." Evelyn placed the photo on her mantel, next to one of her late husband. She sat back in her armchair, a warm smile on her face. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. And somewhere, miles away, Nathaniel stood tall and proud, knowing his family was safe, his mission accomplished, and the future wide open.